take it away, Kristen.
All right, cool. Well, thanks, Sarah. We have a small group, but that's okay because then we can interact a bit more, hopefully, and feel free to chime in the chat about, who you are, maybe where in the world you are, what type of things you do, and that can get us to know each other a little bit better. Just saying, this is a very high level talk. So if you're expecting nitty gritty details and, schematics and all sorts of specs or anything, that this is not the talk. It's very, very high level. So if you've done tons of decoupled and static and, you're an expert programmer and that kind of thing, you're welcome to stay and hang out with us and maybe chime in the chat when other people have questions. Totally cool. But just setting expectations that this is very, very high level. Oops. So I'm Kristen, and I am a co-founder at Quant. Here's some ways of getting a hold of me. And so, yeah, like Sarah said, I've been at Stanford camps for since the beginning, maybe, I don't even remember, a long time, and definitely have presented a lot of things as well. So I'm happy to be here. And just a tiny bit about Quant. This is not a sales pitch, but we host static websites and have a CDN. We have special integrations with Drupal and WordPress and all your fun static site generators. So some disclaimers, like I said, I do work at Quant. This is not a sales pitch. Quant will show up occasionally in some of the lists, but I'm trying to be very fair and balanced and include all the different options that you might want to consider. I am a backend developer mostly, among many, many other hats, but I've dabbled in front end certainly over the years, but I am not a front-end developer by any stretch. So if you have a question specifically about a particular front-end framework, I am not the person to answer that question, but maybe we have someone in the room that can. And another disclaimer is I'm listing out a lot of different possible technologies and things. I have not used all this stuff, right? There's anyone that's been in web or any kind of technology, right? There's so many options out there, and I can't claim to know all of these things. So I'm listing them there. Doesn't mean I've used it. I'm not necessarily even endorsing it. I'm just kind of this is a survey, right, of the things available. And lastly, my family's not supposed to be out in this space, so hopefully that will be respected. But if you hear some noises, they forgot, but I think we'll be okay. All right. So we're going to discuss at a very, very high level why you might use decoupled, kind of what it is, why you might use it, some approaches for decoupled, again, very, very high level, why you might want to use static and static site generators, and some hosting options. And then this was historically a Drupal camp and has expanded, but I have a special spot in my heart for Drupal. Exactly. So John's sporting a Drupal camp shirt. So I will dedicate a little bit of time specifically for decoupling Drupal, because I know Drupal is still a big thing at Stanford and at many places. So, there are some cool solutions there. And at any time, feel free to, ask questions in the chat. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, but I think Sarah will be. So just, chime out, interrupt me at any time if there's specific questions that are contextual that we want to make sure that we answer. Okay, so why decoupled? What is decoupled? So decoupled basically usually have a front end and a back end, and the front end grabs stuff from the back end and it shows it on the web, right? So that's very simplistic. One thing I will say is don't decouple if you don't need to, please. You don't over architect your websites, right? use it if it makes sense, but don't do it just because it's trendy or, oh, my friend's doing it or whatever, right? Use the things that make sense for your use case. But there are some pros and cons for decoupled. And one of the big ones is flexibility, because you may have on your team a really amazing React person, a developer that, does great work in React, and maybe you have a great, WordPress, developer who does great backend work, and you want to be able to use those skills in order to make something amazing for your website. So, the flexibility of decoupled is you can kind of just pick the best tool for the job, right? And some of these things, again, this is all with a caveat, right? These really depend on what technology you're choosing. Because performance, well, if you pick a front end that's maybe not the most performant, then maybe that's going to go over to the con side, right? So take all of these with a little grain of salt. But ideally, you're picking a front end that is really tuned for websites and for better, user experience and better performance and better security and that kind of thing. So as far as the downsides, obviously complexity, right? You got more stuff going on. You got a front end, you got a back end, you've got more developers. Maybe they don't know both technologies, so you have more team members, and then as a result, you've got higher costs and more support, and maybe a more complex workflow. And for workflow, it could be both the workflow for your developers, right? You have that whole flow that you're dealing with going, building stuff in the back end, and how does it get to the front end? And, do you have, CI, CD stuff? There's anyone who's done technology in the web, right? You can make things super complex if you want to. But there's also the workflow for the content editor, because the content editor, ideally, they enter content and boom, they see it. And sometimes with decoupled, it's not that way, right? They have to wait 5 minutes for some build to happen, or, or they check it from a different website, or, so it can be kind of interesting when you have decoupled. So you have to kind of keep these things in mind when you're choosing. So when is it a good choice? It can be a good choice. And I've worked on, monolithic Drupal sites. I've worked on decoupled Drupal sites. And, sometimes it was a good good choice to go decoupled, and sometimes it wasn't, right? So it really depends. But like we talked about, picking the best tool for the job, right? Looking at the skill sets you have to work with, figuring out, what you want it to look like. Maybe you can pick a front-end framework that has a lot of already configured, components, and you can just easily throw stuff together, and it just makes the whole experience much faster for development. Or maybe you need to get approval for the front end before, you need to decouple it, because you want to do a light and lean front end and, get approval on that first before you go in and build all the back end to support that, right? So there's a lot of different reasons that you might want to choose decoupled. And here's just some of them. Omnichannel, that's just a fancy word for, you're showing your content all sorts of places. It might be a website or multiple websites, different ones. It could be showing up in chatbot answers these days, or, it could be a digital sign or all sorts of things, right? So lots of reasons why you might want to choose decoupled. And there are a lot of different ways you can decouple. And again, this is super high level and just samples of what you can do. So we'll talk more about static in a little bit, but static is a way of decoupling, right? You can have a backend, whether it's a CMS like Drupal, whether it's literally markdown files, like text files with text in them, and then, pushing it out to a static site. That's a pretty simple version of a decoupled architecture. But then you can start getting more complicated and throwing in middlewares and front, all this fun stuff. So you can have a dynamic front end, JavaScript front end that we'll talk about in a sec. But, you know, again, you can make these things as complex as you would like, as sometimes happens, and, you know, have all these different consumers of the content that are taking it and showing it in different ways and slicing and dicing it. Or maybe you have a lot of backends that you need to deal with and you need to, you know, aggregate content together and that kind of thing. So these are not suggestions. None of these are suggestions. They're ways people, you know, glue these layers together and try to, you know, get the content basically from, you know, a content editor or some data source, right? And then shown to the public on some, you know, whether it be a website or a mobile app or that kind of thing. All right, and other thing in chat, if you want to say like, what have you worked with any static technologies? Have you worked with any decoupled technologies? Feel free to say what you've used, you know, even your experience and that sort of thing. And I'll be able to read the chats later, but yeah, and again, any questions or chiming in is all good. So backends for decoupled. Like I mentioned, you could literally have text files with, you know, markdown, and you know, that could be your quote unquote backend, right? But most likely you want some sort of system that lets a content editor, you know, fill in the content in an easy way, and then you'll have a front end that would be able to consume that and then present it in a nice way, right? So here are some examples of backends that you can use. My soft spot is obviously for Drupal. So I've been using it for almost 20 years, but you know, we might have some WordPress fans out there, all good. I have no problem with WordPress, but there are also some, so those are like your more traditional CMSs, but then there's also a little bit more decoupled focused content systems as well that you may have heard of, or you know, you may have played with. So, you know, Contentful is kind of the obvious one. And then for front end, you know, for JavaScript frameworks, you know, I'm sure if you're in the web world, you've heard at least some of these. I would guess you've probably heard of React and Angular, Vue maybe, which has gained popularity just in the last few years. And then threw in some ones that you may not have heard of, but that, you know, get a bit of a buzz in the developer community, along with some kind of what popularity they have is among, you know, front-end developers. So again, like, which would you choose? I mean, it really depends on, you know, really depends on your team, because you're going to want to leverage, you know, the tools that they are most comfortable with, or maybe they've decided that what they are most comfortable with isn't the right tool for the job anymore, and they would like to actually, you know, expand their skills and work in something else. So like, I've seen a lot of people go from Angular to React, right? They've worked in Angular for years, and then they're like, yeah, I don't know, I'm hitting this limitation, that one, I'm not liking it so much anymore. And so they decide, you know, I'm gonna learn React and use that framework instead. So again, I'm not a front-end person. I have dabbled in a number of these, but it's not my, you know, my normal day job. So that just gives you a very high level overview of kind of decoupled and some of the things that, you know, kind of some backends that you might be interested in looking at, or some front ends, JavaScript frameworks for that, and why you might want to use decoupled. Now, static is a particular type of decoupling, right? With the previous examples, those JavaScript front ends, normally you have those are for a dynamic website, right? Normally you have some dynamic features, and it doesn't have to be, you can use some of those with static, but you know, you might have little widgets on the site, and maybe they're, you know, grabbing stuff from the database and showing stats or graphs or things and more interesting real-time information. But sometimes you don't need that. Sometimes your site is just, brochureware. It's a simple site. It's a blog site. It's, there's no like e-commerce functionality or anything particularly dynamic about it, right? So then static can be an option. So static basically, so a static site is normally you have the markup, so the HTML, you've got the JavaScript files. If, usually people still will have JavaScript files, but it's client-side JavaScript. Then you've got your CSS, so you get your styling, your pretty stuff. And then you have, whatever images, probably wouldn't have videos. Usually those are often YouTube or Vimeo or something, but so you have those physical files, right? And then you put them on static hosting, and often you'll use something called a CDN, which is a content delivery network, where those files get pushed around the world. Copies of the files are pushed around the world so that any user, maybe in Italy, they're getting content, from Italy, or maybe it's coming from London, if that's the closest location where the content is stored. Right. So those files, there's no talking back to a database. There's no backend. Now you can use the backend to build the site, but there's no backend that you're communicating from the site. And some pros and cons of using static. It may not be obvious, but costs can actually be better. And the reason is because hosting is expensive. So if you're going to host a static site, usually static hosting can be quite cheap. But if you're going to host databases and, Drupal and front ends and all these kind of, back-endy things to drive your site, those can be very, very expensive to host. And if you can go static, then you can actually lock down your back end so that the only people that are accessing the back end are your content editors and your site admins, and just a few people that really need, to be in there. And as a result, you're not getting all of your public web traffic hitting that back end. So you don't need as many resources. So you can kind of shrink down that back end cost for hosting to something, simpler. And then, so coupling that with the lower cost of the static, typically your infrastructure costs can actually go down quite a bit. And then another big thing is, because you're using less resources, it tends to be greener. Now, of course, this is, again, take all of this with a grain of salt. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on your configuration and all that. But generally, one of the big points of static is you want to try to be more environmentally friendly. You want to try to use less resources and reduce your footprint, right? So that is one of the big pros if you have that in mind. Now, performance. So again, remember what I said, like sometimes it can go either side. I mean, maybe the performance, you can have a static site that is not performant. Sure. You can fill it full of huge images and add in, all sorts of weird JavaScript that's, bogging down the whole page. You can do Google Tag Manager and insert all of these analytic scripts in there, right? So just because it's static doesn't mean it's performant, but one of the big points of trying to go static is to make it more performant, right? You're not doing database calls, you're not grabbing stuff from the back end. So it's just these files, you loaded them into the browser, they're being cached, they're right there, and that's what you're getting. So, usually you will get that benefit of better performance. Now, you still have some cons, right? It's static, right? If you have dynamic information and you have a static site, well, that, where is that going? Now, you can have a hybrid. So instead of just a fully static site, you can actually have a hybrid. So maybe most of the site is static, and then you have some certain URLs that are, they call it proxied, where they actually do go back to the backend in order to generate dynamic information. So you could go fully static, you could go partially static, you can go fully dynamic, right? So there's all of these ways of using these technologies. So when is static a good choice? If you don't have a lot of dynamic functionality, and maybe you have an international audience and you want to be able to push your content all around the world and have, all of this fast and easy for your web visitors that are everywhere, then it might be a good choice. Also, if your organization has to meet certain security standards, so there's compliance needs, and sometimes like with government, certain organizations where they have to meet certain security guidelines, then this is, you can't really get as secure because there's no way to hack it, right? The files are all there. The web browser has all the files for the website. So there's no way for some hacker to try to break in, and your backend can all be locked down and tightened up. So, and then we talked about the reducing the carbon footprint as well. So in order to create a static site, there's a number of ways to do it, but one popular approach is using a static site generator. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So it's pretty well named. A static site generator basically makes a static site. So it takes either those text files or some other data source, and it just figures out how to make static web pages out of those. And these are rough examples of workflows. Again, you can make things as complicated as you want, but at the bare minimum, you have some content source, the static site generator that takes that content, creates static pages, put it into static hosting, and then your end users. Ideally, you have CDN with that static hosting, and then the end users are able to see that content. You can start throwing stuff in there and doing all sorts of other things on the back end. You can still have a static site and leverage, JavaScript frameworks and all this other stuff, because maybe you want to use those to build certain components, and if you like the way they glue together and make landing pages and things like that. So these are just, some examples of how you might weave them into your workflow. And as far as popular site generators, static site generators, there's a number, and some of them are actually, we saw them earlier because like Next is actually also a front-end framework, but you can generate static, Gatsby as well, right? So you get some of those where they have multiple hats and you can use them for both. And then there's some that are more special purposed, like Jekyll and things where, it's just their sole purpose is doing that static site generation. So if you've used any of these static site generators, feel free to put some in the chat, especially if there's nothing or ones that aren't included here. So static hosting options. There's so many. If you're a DIY, do-it-yourselfer, you can go that. You can go generic hosting options. You can use managed plans, all sorts of things. And basically, the thing about static hosting, usually they're doing some optimization for the fact that it's all static assets. And usually that will mean like you want to use a CDN to make sure that, this is around the world at different locations, but they might also build in some things like image optimization or, certain things that you kind of expect in order to make the static site even faster. Oops, there, I missed it. There we go. So this is just some. So feel free in the chat to throw in like your favorite hosting option for static, but there are a lot. Like I mentioned, I'm at Quant, so obviously Quant is on the list, but you can go from very simple approaches, which are like your, GitHub pages, Cloudflare pages, all those kind of things, where, typically sort of a simple sort of hosting option to, your DIY, generic hosting of your DigitalOcean and Linode and that kind of thing. And then on the bottom, there's a lot of, usually a little bit more full-featured hosting options. They might give you more bells and whistles. For example, a WAF, like a web application firewall, in addition, which, if you have fully static, you think, oh, well, maybe I don't need that. But, you can still keep out bad actors just to reduce the amount of traffic hitting your site, right? If you get some sort of, foreign entity trying to, just get at all your assets or whatever, and you can, try to minimize that. So these are some options. I'm sure you've probably heard, especially in the Drupal world, probably platform, people are familiar with that. Netlify has been a big, actually today and yesterday, some Netlify talks, and Netlify was used for the serverless architecture that was talked about yesterday as well. So I'm sure that's known in Stanford land, but there are a lot of options. Now let's talk a little bit about decoupling Drupal in particular, because that is sort of my soft spot, and it is sort of the roots of this camp. And again, don't decouple unless you need to, but it can make sense, as we talked about different reasons before why it might make sense. But there's different approaches to decoupling in Drupal that you can leverage. So one approach is sort of scraping a site, which means that you're using more of an external tool to grab all of the web pages and the JavaScript files and the images and all that. You scrape it, and then you put that into hosting. So that's one option. Another is you use an internal module, Drupal module, that allows you to push the content from within Drupal to a specific hosting provider. The other is rolling your own, right? Using the Drupal's APIs, and I've done this where you're using whatever system. In my case, I was using Next, but you use whatever system, and then you're leveraging Drupal's APIs and pulling in content and mixing and matching and putting them together. In my case, I was using it for, there was a design system, and I was marrying the design system with the content and, packaging them together, and then we were pushing it out. And the last option here is there's some very specialized frameworks that are actually available for Drupal, which not everyone might be familiar with. So we'll touch upon those as well. So scraping, so caveat, Quant has a web crawler if you wanted to scrape and host in Quant, but basically there are lots of crawlers out there. Anyone who's done command line stuff, maybe you've done wget or you've done curl or, things like that. I mean, that's as simple as it gets, right? Or, there's more full-featured crawlers that are available that are open source and available to you. So basically you just crawl the site, grab all the files and put them in a static hosting, and there you got your website. And then the other approach is using a Drupal module, and Quant has a module, but there's also others. There's a static site generator module, which in Drupal 7 was called static generator. And then I don't know if anyone's familiar with this whole Tome ecosystem, but Tome is a module that lets you create a static site from Drupal. And then there are additional modules that kind of plug into that. So the ones that I could find were for AWS S3, Azure, GitHub, and Netlify, of sort of additional modules you could plug in order to push that Tome static export into those specific hosting options. If there are others, I looked and those are the ones that I found. But if you know of others that actually work, I did find some where I was like, maybe, I don't know, it doesn't look very well maintained. So yeah, feel free to chime in if you have some other options there. Now, using Drupal's APIs, if you're a programmer and you need to, if you're doing middleware or some front end where you need to, query the information directly from Drupal, this is straight from the Drupal.org docs about, use REST if it's a non-entity data, and otherwise use JSON API. In recent years, I've pretty much just used JSON API for everything, but those are available to you. And then there's these special integrations, which I talked about. So if you are doing Vue.js for your front end, you may want to check out Drux.js as sort of this middleware for Drupal and Nuxt, which is built with Vue. So that's an option that's supported by Reality Loop, and that's been around for a few years. Then there's Gatsby, which probably anyone in the web world who, especially if you do front end stuff, I'm sure you've heard of Gatsby, and they've been at various Drupal events and stuff like that. And that's supported by Gatsby, the company, and then also by Media Current and Third and Grove, I believe. And then the last one that I'll note here is Next Drupal, which is supported by Chapter 3. So if you want to work in that next space, if you haven't already, then this might be an option. If you have already, then you've probably heard of this as an option. But these are a little more full featured than some of the kind of easy plugin modules. So something to check out if you want to make your site decoupled and are interested in either Vue or React or Next in this case. And with that, I will call it good for the organized part of it. But before we do questions though, I did put the slides up on this session page already, but so there are a bunch of links so I've linked off to all of these different things. So feel free to download that and grab that. If you want links to all the different technologies, and I'm sure there are more. So with that, happy to have questions.
Well, the first question I see is from John about scraper technology. Do you want to come off mute, John?
Sure. Yeah, you were talking about those scrapers. How do you have some firewall rules, some allow and deny lists to allow only your scrapers? Because if the intention is to decouple and have public traffic be to your static site generator, how do you handle allowing a full bot to scrape your entire CMS?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're going to use a web scraper, but your site is behind a firewall already, is that what you're saying? Or
no, I'm asking. So if you're going to use a scraper, it has to be the site has to be publicly available, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, if you're going to do it internally and you own the site and you have access, internally, then you could probably, configure it with certain keys and things like that to make sure that you can access it behind the scenes. The examples I was doing was more like, oh, it's out in the wild, it's a public site, I just want to scrape it and maybe even ditch all my previous stuff if I wanted to.
And then you just rely on obscurity to keep your CMS from showing up in search engines and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, no, as far as like the robots and stuff like that, yeah, obviously you would want to specify, who can crawl the site. But if you had basically Drupal and then a static version of it, and you're doing it with a crawler, then you're going to need some way to be able to give the credentials in order to do that. Now, I haven't done that myself with Scrapey or any of those. And personally, I've mainly used at least with the quant crawler, I've mainly used that for getting it off of a technology and just making it completely static. So that's actually a good question. I should know that. How you would point at it, for something that's like behind a firewall or something. Because I mean, the whole point then is to lock it down, right? You don't want both sites out in the wild. I mean, sometimes people they'll obscure like you mentioned, like obscure the URL or the domain, right? And make it some weird, unguessable. It's not edit.example.com. It's some a big long string or whatever. But yeah, so I don't think that was fully answered it, but touched upon
it did. Thanks. That's something that I've been trying to wrap my head around. So thanks.
Okay, cool. Any other questions?
I did have another question. You talked about cost savings for having a CMS of whatever sort running, and then it's cheaper to have the public traffic be on a static site hosting. Do you have any A/B comparisons for that? Because there are definitely ways to heavily cache and CDN WAF in front of, let's just say, a Drupal site. Do you have anything that is
some like hard data? You're looking for hard data. Yeah, I should definitely get some hard data and make a blog post about that, because again, there's so many ways you can mix and match and configure and stuff. Like you can have a simple static site and have performance be a nightmare and horrible, and like even the storage footprint look big because you're storing these ridiculously large image files or videos, right? So do I have any, data that I could just hand over? No, not really. But I think that would be, it would be good to take something that's like for like, right?
Yeah, that's our challenge, is that we're doing this. We're starting to do this more on new projects rather than a standalone, and we're struggling to find the A/B comparison.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite A/B, because ideally you'd want, well, if you wanted to test quant, I'm just saying, you could point, if it was a public website, you could point the crawler at it and then have it, and then use that and then run some lighthouse tests and stuff like that. This is not cost, so that's performance. As far as the costing, yeah, I would need to, it's so hard. Because it depends on who you're choosing for the hosting. I don't know, is this all internal hosting, or, the servers themselves, or rack space? I don't know where you're hosting your stuff, but
that's all right. You just gave my boss some things for me to work on them in this performance year.
Okay, good.
This year, I was going to ask you to do it next week. I agree with John. I think it's been one of the biggest challenges for us as a larger team has been figuring out how to calculate this so that we can give accurate estimates of cost prior to making a commitment to where things are going to live. So it's a chicken and the egg problem. You want to build and figure out where the best place to build and publish to is, but in order to do that, you have to have budget for it. You have to be able to explain the budget, explain cost drivers like storage and size and traffic, and what's the benefit in a financial sense of decoupling the site. And it has been an absolute nightmare to figure out and calculate. So if you decide that you are going to tackle that as a research problem and try and get a model and get some case studies out there, boy howdy would I make use of it.
Yeah. Okay. I have some homework too, then, it sounds like.
Yours won't be on any sort of performance evaluation. No, that's just John's.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's all, I mean, there's so much, right? There's just so many things you can pick from, so many ways you can configure it. You can shoot yourself in the foot for the simplest thing, or you can optimize everything so nicely, but it's complex, but you've optimized it so well with all your caching and whatever that you're just like perfect, right? So yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, feels a little bit like the Wild West, right? All over the place. All right, any other questions?
think there was one sort of comment, sort of question early in the chat, which was, can you talk a little bit more about your decision-making process for when it makes sense to go decoupled and when it doesn't?
Okay, yeah. I mean, we talked a little bit about that. So I don't know if the question happened before that slide about
It was
decoupled or
mere
not.
seconds into your presentation, so
Okay.
maybe
Yeah.
a little bit.
But you know, there's this whole monolith versus, you know, serverless or decouple or all this sort of thing. And to be honest, you know, I'm a big fan of the monolith. I am. You know, use it if it works. I'm also a big fan of static though, so you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, or whatever the phrase is, right? If assuming you have a fairly static site, and or you can route back to certain routes for dynamic stuff. But yeah, I love Drupal and the flexibility it provides, and it's so rich and it's so flexible and it's got so much there. But again, I'm not a front end person. So front end people would be like, yeah, I don't want to do the theming in Drupal. I want to use React, or I want to use, Vue, or I want to use whatever, right? Pick your fashionable front end framework of the day, right? Svelte, I think, started getting some buzz in the last couple of years or so. So yeah, I think it's a hard choice, and it shouldn't just be skill driven, because it might not be a good business use case, right? But if you have a really simple website, obviously don't decouple it. But if you have, like, some of these frameworks have some really nice web components that you could, like Next, wow, it's just like libraries of stuff you can mix and mingle and just make some really cool things, right? So it just really depends. Like, you can't just say, well, these check the boxes. Yeah, if these check the boxes, then I do decoupled, right? It's all contextual, really depends on what your site is. But I would say, and actually Shay said it yesterday, because I asked him in the serverless talk, I said, okay, if you're going to start over again, would you do, what would you change? And he actually said, he's like, well, I'd probably do more of a monolith and start breaking it out little by little. And that's kind of my approach. Like, I don't know. I try not to over bake it, because then you're just getting more complex. You're getting higher costs. It's harder to maintain, all those things. So, but again, I'm not a front end person. So front end person would be like, no, I really want to use my React. I really want to use my Vue. So, and I get it. And there's some cool things that you can get with those. So it depends. That's the answer. All right, I think we're out of time. I don't know if there's any other questions, but
Nothing in chat. Anybody on the screen?
Front end developers are people too.
they are. I mean, the front end development has become, the reason why I stopped doing it is it became so complex.
It is. It really
Right?
is. And
It
it's
just,
impressive, the work they
I
do.
was like, okay, I used to do theming back in the day, Drupal theming. And then I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? Okay, nope, I give up. You can have it. So yeah, no, hats off to them. It's pretty cool. Cool stuff.
Kristen, thank you very much for a great session.
All right, thank
I
you.
think closer to the end, there was there was a very important conversation about giving an estimate to the end user, because everyone knows English is not my first language. So what I'm trying to say is, at the end of the day, the end user is the end user. And when we're building things, we need to consider what is, like, how much is all the features and all the nice shiny toys that we're using gonna cost our end user, whether it is content editor or somebody who is coming to admission site to find how much it's going to be tuition for next year. So thank you to everyone who contributed to this discussion and highlighting the fact that all the shiny toys that we have at the end of the day convert into this dollar number at the bottom of our proposal. And this is where people decide, yes, we're gonna do this, or we're gonna do this. So
Right.
that was terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you touched upon something that we didn't maybe quite articulate, which was the design, right? If the design has all sorts of really elaborate things and maybe not a lot of repeating components and a lot, that can also, someone might look at it and go, oh, okay, well, sure, I can build that custom. But then, even at that level, right, you're going to be like, well, maybe we should standardize, simplify, maybe we should leverage some of the existing design systems that are out there and things like that, right? So, yeah, it starts from the beginning, right? The planning stage in that design phase, it can really trickle down into getting a very costly site from a technology point of view and maintenance and all that. So it's hard, and estimates are hard. They're so hard.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying to have to think about hosting costs as part of your initial discovery.
Yeah, no, that's fair though. Yeah, you definitely have to. And then how do you do that in a way that is,
And you're making technology decisions before you even know anything.
Yep. No, that's quite a challenge. So, all right. Well, it's been fun conversation. Happy to have any other chime in.
Thank you, Kristen. It's always great to have you at our camp.
Yeah, and I hope to see at least some of you soon in a few minutes. I'm going to drive over in a little bit. So thanks, everybody. Okay, bye.
Bye.